Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
My name is Clancy Imislund. I'm an alcoholic. I'm very glad to be here this afternoon. I'd like to just say a few words to stir it up a little bit. All of you folks sitting in the back, standing in the back, you'll be glad to know that there are a couple tables down here that are reserved for people who didn't show up. I'm not judging, I'm just telling you this. So I know you don't mind standing as long as you know that. But we are... one of the hallmarks of this particular get-together, and it isn't anybody's fault, and I know Shirley is not a fan of it, but everything is saved all the time. Everywhere you go, something has been... You go out to that pool at 6 in the morning, it's already been saved since 5. And then they go back to bed and stay there till 2 in the afternoon. There's never anybody uses the seats, but there's always saved. And people say to me, isn't that unjust? I say, I have no opinion. I've given up fighting all things and all people. But we are here today. This is not really a regular meeting. We've had some excellent speakers, and we have more excellent speakers coming. And this is not a regular AA meeting. This is just kind of a discussion. One of Millie's Shady Bunch group. And I've been asked to say a few words about a disease of perception, which is just a little bit about the misconceptions that many people come here with and maintain after they get to AA, and what happens to people who look at AA and wonder why it is the way it is. I guess it would be safe to say, although it isn't ever formally written down anywhere, but that there probably at least are 3 or more types of alcoholics. And they are confusing to one and all because they seem the same, but they look different. You take some drunken people, and they all look the same. But there seem to be at least 3 different types of alcoholics. One would be an alcoholic who drinks like an alcoholic and drinks to excess and drinks too much. And he gets to a point in his life or her life where something really threatening or dramatic happens, a death in the family or a loss of a home or a loss of a very long time job or the loss of relationships or something. And this shocks that drinker into stopping drinking. And there are many, many cases of these kind of cases where they drank a great deal, but then when something really traumatic happened, they stopped. That's one type of alcoholic, I guess. And another type of alcoholic would be another drunk who becomes not only emotionally addicted, but becomes physiologically addicted to alcohol. And they find it very, very difficult to withdraw them from alcohol. Incidentally, I don't know if anyone knows this or ever thinks about this, but withdrawal from alcoholism is about 10 times as lethal as the withdrawal from drugs, any drug. Has been said before, you put 30 drug addicts in a room and leave them there for a few days, and you come back and you find an awful lot of sick people. But if you put 30 advanced alcoholics in a room and come back in a few days, you find a lot of sick people and some dead people. Ha ha ha, not very funny. But because the withdrawal from alcohol is really rather difficult. And that's these people who become severely physiologically addicted usually require, and many times require, some degree of hospitalization. as they did in Bill Wilson's day, as they did in before that and after that, where they, it sounds kind of peculiar now to young people, but in the early days of AA, in fact, when I started going to AA, when people went on 12-step calls, they took a pint of whiskey with them to help the guy get off, to give him a couple drinks so he would not go into those convulsions. I see people in my job now going to convulsions quite often. I see different people, not the same person, go quite often. And it really is a terrible thing. It's a kind of the only bright spot about it is the only person it doesn't affect is the person having the convulsion. To him, he just faints. But everybody around him, he's terrible, terrible spasms. But these people have to go to hospitals, be physiologically withdrawn. And that's, I think, how some of the hospitals today, Schick Shadell, I think of, at least I guess they still do it, I know they used to, talk about how they can cure alcoholism in 7 days with a couple follow-ups. And they literally do that. You go into the hospital and they give you excellent treatment, and you get off and you are now aware of the terribleness of what you've been in, and you have some follow-ups and you're off. That's a different type of alcoholic. They are withdrawn and they are made aware of the intensity of their problem. And then there's the other type of alcoholic, which you're going to be just whispering all day long here. Then there's the other type of alcoholic, and it seems to me include people like me. I presume like most of you if we're here. And they are the people who drink also just like everybody else. Some become physically addicted, some don't. But they are eventually sobered up, taken off alcohol, made aware of the intensity of their problem, become involved in the deep difficulty they are located in, and despite all this, sooner or later, must always eventually drink again. Much to the surprise of everybody around them, much to the surprise of people who love them, people who depend on them, and more importantly, much to the surprise of the patient himself or herself. And that has always been the great puzzle. And I guess for most people around, people like you and me, they look at these other types of alcoholics and say, look, my Uncle Fred, he once upon a time drank as bad as you did, but when it got bad, he quit. Can't you quit? And people like me have quit. Only to drink again. And you hear someone say, if you just go through this hospital program, go to this withdrawal, as I did in another place, another city. I went through the withdrawal in a hospital, and I came out of there determined I was going to be all right for my children's sake and for nothing else. And much to my surprise, and everyone else's surprise, I drank again. And it just gets to be baffling. That ridiculous analogy they use in the big book about this jaywalker, it's really that ridiculous to people around us. I mean, why would you do that? And there's no answer. The only effective answer when you really get cornered is, let me alone. Leave me alone. Leave me alone. You don't understand. So for thousands of years, there have been people getting off alcohol because of trauma. Some have gotten off because of physical help. And then there's been this vast preponderance of people like you and me who don't get off, who get off and get on and get off and get on. And in the last 5,000 or 6,000 years, as long as there's been regular usage of alcohol, there's always been people like us, and it's always been a bafflement to everyone. At one time, they used to put them to death because they thought they were possessed with the devil, and they're flogged and flayed and sent away. I was down in Australia earlier this week, and they were talking about this whole penal colony that started out in Botany Bay. Most of them were long-term alcoholics from England, creating crimes, and with the addition of their terrible drinking, and send them over there. Don't let them ever come back to England, because there's no cure for these people. And so you think, well, now AA has been formed, and now there's a way out because we understand this. I don't think Bill Wilson, I think, intuitively understood it. He didn't really have as much knowledge as anybody in this room has because there just wasn't that much knowledge available. But throughout the book, he seems to mention that phrase that as he's kind of groped to define it. alcoholics of our type. Alcoholics, he doesn't mention any other types, but there just seem to be alcoholics of our type. And it's kind of funny because even in the 63 years of Alcoholics Anonymous existence, and the only successful therapy for alcoholics on a long-term basis, there was a short one, of course, in the 1840s, the Washingtonians, but they stopped helping alcoholics. They started helping narcotics addicts and stamping out the use of alcohol and got in politics, and they all died drunk. But this is the only long-term effectual program for alcoholics, and yet people cannot accept it today and haven't been able to accept it for years and years. I look back at just the years I've been around Alcoholics Anonymous. In the 1950s, it's kind of amusing some of the efforts people make to try to avoid the type of abstinence we offer with involved action. In the 1950s, it was the first time, I think, that there really was any feeling, or the late 1940s, that there was something about drinking, these drinking problems that had some medical background. And most of us are familiar that in the early 1950s, it was a great surprise to the medical community when they decided to give AA the Lasker Award for the greatest advance in public health. And that was 1951, I guess. And then the early 1950s, too, they thought, once and for all, let's find out what alcoholism is, help these people, and get rid of it. And they started an immense school of alcoholic studies at Yale University. And they really went all out to once and for all extinguish it. It's like you'd try to understand pneumonia or AIDS or something. Let's get some understanding. And they studied all kinds of drunks from all over, and all kinds. They had people, non-alcoholics in there. They had all people of all sorts of social backgrounds and economic backgrounds and all sorts of patterns. You know, they'd give them tests. They'd give a known alcoholic a couple drinks, and then a known non-alcoholic a couple drinks, and see if they could determine any difference in their reaction. I've always thought that'd be a great test to be in, wouldn't it? You know, here's your drink. Have another one. Thanks, don't mind if I do. That's all for today. Bullshit it is. But they did all kinds of psychological testing and all kinds of testing. And they wound up with a report this thick. In fact, they continued that school of alcoholic studies, moved to Rutgers University. Later, I guess, in one form or another, still existence. They have a school of alcoholic studies at the University of Utah. But they really had a long report. And I did not read the report all the way through. I glanced at the summation of it, and someone else gave me an even more concise summation. But as far as I could determine, they really found nothing that all these alcoholics had in common. The known alcoholics. They found two things that they seemed to have in common, and they couldn't understand any reason for that. One thing is that the known alcoholics seemed to have a different psychological profile on their testing after they drank. And that shouldn't be. You should have just same psychological profile, maybe a little bit different, but not a changed person. And secondly, they all ranked in the top 5 percentile of perfectionism, which I don't understand because I've never been a perfectionist. I just want things to be right or screw it, you know. That's all out. But anyway, they had this, and they studied. I got sober. And then some scientists at the University of Saskatchewan in Utah, they're always working hard to help folks. And in the mid to late 1950s, they isolated a chemical which they identified as would be a tremendous help to alcoholics. It would bring about an ability to break through this core of lack of self-understanding or something. And they brought it forth, and they experimented with it. In fact, they sent some of their new chemical to UCLA. In the end of 1958, early 1959, I think it was December, January, they came down from UCLA to the AA club behind whose building I was sleeping in an abandoned car. waiting to make my move to Palm Springs. And they wanted 10 volunteers to come out to UCLA and take the new test of this new chemical. And I volunteered like a rocket, Thought maybe I'd get a square meal and a change of clothes. And they looked at me, and I didn't have any front teeth, and I had some old clothes I'd been living in for weeks. And I felt they felt I wouldn't give their chemical a fair shake. So they took 10 other people out to UCLA, and I just missed the great January 1959 test of the new chemical LSD. True story. And I thought, if I would have taken that test, I could have been something. As you might imagine, I only know 2 of them that ever got back. I only know 2 that ever got back of those 10. And also at that same time, there's something. A guy asked me about this. I was at some place called Alice Springs, which is 1,000 miles from any other town in Australia. It's out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, just nowhere. You figure people say, "What's the big buck?" And some guy came up to me and said, "What's this about Bill Wilson taking LSD?" He said it with he didn't say it as nicely as I said it. He cursed. But that's interesting. A lot of people always, Bill Wilson took LSD. I'll tell you how that happened. Because the scientists also convinced him it might be of help to alcoholics. And he decided to try it because there's nobody ahead of him. And he took it under laboratory conditions. He put him in a laboratory, and he took this LSD to see if there was something to help alcoholics. And he immediately realized there wasn't. And that was the end of it. He was not taking drugs to get away. He was trying to help you and me, and as he often did, try to find things that would be of help to the alcoholics behind him. Well, that was the end of the LSD surge for a couple of years till it hit the street. Then I finally, in my time, I got a job finally. And when I was about 2 years sober, I got a little job as a writer in a medical corporation. And I still didn't have any front teeth, but I learned to carry my lip like this. Nobody thought I didn't have front teeth. They thought I'd been burned in a fire. But I went to work every day, and I had a harsh sponsor who insisted I go to work and so on. But while I was working in this medical corporation, I happened to be there when, to the best of my knowledge, the first advertising for the treatment of alcoholism ever took place in a medical magazine. In the Journal of the American Medical Association, there was a "Physicians, at last you can treat your problem drinkers and alcoholics." And I read that and thought, God, if I only would have hung on another couple of years, I wouldn't have to go to all these meetings. And there was this new drug, and it just had a smack of freedom. It was called Librium. And oh, man. I thought, boy, wonderful. I wish I'd have got that. Of course, a few months later, the first Librium survivors came back to the meetings. But I haven't drank. Then from then on, there were just a series of little tests. Later, I got a little job. In the mid-'60s, I was working. I moved to KHJ, where I was. Another guy and I created this thing called Boss Radio. We became the #1 hard rock station in the world. Then I moved to television, and I was slicked by now, and I had front teeth. There's something, in case you're new here. If you're new, I don't know what the hell you're doing here anyway. But if you are, once you become spiritually perfect, your teeth grow back. But they had I looked at our program for the upcoming week, and I was in charge of promotion then, and the things I had to promote was a speaker who came to discuss how alcoholics have been returned to social drinking. And I thought, well, I didn't really want to return to social drinking by that time, but I was interested in proving the old-timers wrong. And but it turned out this guy was a representative of Shadell Hospital in Seattle. in Chick-Shadell Hospital had isolated some things that if you took them and redressed your body's imbalance, alcoholics could drink again. And I thought, how could this be? But I'll tell you, I went down and stood behind the camera and watched this guy, I'll tell you. And he gave a little talk on it. At the end, he said, I'm the director of the program, he said. And they say alcoholics can't do this. And he lifted up a martini and drank it. And I didn't even want the martini, but my tongue went, just a conditioned reflex. And I thought, God, isn't that something? But about a month later, apparently, this guy's imbalance came back because he wound up in a padded cell at Chick-Shadell, and 2 weeks after that, they stopped their program of returning alcoholics to social drinking, and they begrudgingly went back to abstinence. But for a while, it looked like a great opening for a lot of people. In the late 1960s, I was coming out here this weekend. I remember this. Over here in Redlands, I think it was Redlands, where White Memorial Hospital is. Is that where White Memorial Hospital is? Big Seventh-day Adventist hospital. And they got about a page and a half of ink in the LA Times on how they had stopped drunkards from drinking. No AA, no nothing, just an excellent therapy. And I read that with awe, and what they had done, they're death on drinking, but they had taken one of their wards and turned it into a bar. A regular bar with a bartender in the back bar. And these poor sick boobs would come in there in the morning. First day, the bartender, you want a drink, pal? She says, you're not going to give me some of that medicine, are you? That makes me sick. Not at all. I swear it's just like it is here. Oh, okay. Give me a little bourbon. Oh. They give them a little shot in a glass, put a cord on it, I guess, so that they wouldn't take the glass away with them. Yeah, one more won't hurt, I don't get. You guys know how to, you Seventh-day Adventists know how to treat alcoholics, I'll tell you. And every day the guys should come by for a few drinks. God, what a wonderful, And one day they'd come in and have a little drink. As they took a drink, they'd shoot an electric shock through that cord. Hold the ice next time, Fred. And then they'd give him a drink without it. That's more like it. Boy, I'll tell you, for a minute there. The poor goofs after that, they're just like fawns in a forest fire. They just didn't. They just never knew. Finally, they'd come in and say, you want a little drink? No, I don't believe I do. And if they did that for 5 days, if they did this for a week, they were cured. And they released them. And they had nothing but cures. It was wonderful. And the Times wrote this long article. It wasn't a year later that somebody did a follow-up on them, and they were all drunk. Most of them had got beyond the first bar that didn't have a cord on their glass. It was just terrible. Then the next big item in the treatment of alcoholics that I recall, most older people remember this. I guess in the early 1970s. Big headlines in the paper. Rand report. Alcoholics can return to drinking. Of course, they had a little squib in there, except those that can't. But we know who they are. And they didn't want to make the mistake they made at White Memorial, so they did follow-up. They did first weekly and then monthly follow-up, so there wouldn't be any of this. And they had all sorts of people all over the country who had returned to social drinking. And about 3 years later, a doctor in North Carolina did a follow-up on them. And he found out most of them were drunk. Fairly all of them. I knew a guy at the Rand company. I said, either in Santa Monica. I said, how did you do your follow-up? Because I thought you'd done something effective. Now it turns out it was all a big scam. Not a scam, but a mistake. He said, I can't understand it. We called him and asked him. Is he some boob somewhere? He just, still okay. Then there was one of the things I enjoyed reading about in the another thing I forgot completely, the big cure for alcohol usage and abuse in the early 1950s. A drug that you can give to drinkers and they won't drink because it makes them sick. And now that's a perfect answer to the drug. Take this and you won't get sick. Wives were known to put it in people's food surreptitiously just to teach the dirty bastards a lesson. Eat your food, Fred. Boom, But nobody could understand why that didn't work. And obviously the reason it didn't work is because when these moral degenerates insisted on drinking, they forgot to take their Antabuse. That's all. Didn't take their Antabuse. They still sell Antabuse as the answer to drinking problems. And it still is ineffectual. But in the 1970s, there was a doctor in New Mexico. I loved reading about him. Who, you'd bring a guy there dead drunk, and he'd take movies of you. Then, 2 weeks later, when you decide you want to drink again, they'd bring you to his office, and he'd run these movies. Say, is this the way you want to be? No, I don't. Then, unfortunately, after that, some of the guys didn't have time to go to the movies on the way to a bar. I've seen that movie. Never mind. And then we've had a rash of all kinds of cures and things, and it goes on and on. There's a movement now where you can return to social drinking, the same old tedious arguments, just little ways to do it. And it's always a baffling thing because people can't understand why people don't respond to this. But look at your watch, Keith. It's almost 2:30. Almost time for the important thing, to play out in the pool. There are some lives I'm sorry I saved. Not yours. I mean, some over there, Keith. But again and again, and even today, the problems continue. I see them again and again. And people can't understand why they don't respond. And people still come to Alcoholics Anonymous when all else has failed. And they can't make it here. And it's the same story all over the world. Of people like you and me, who once upon a time Dr. Jung said that the only way for people like you and me to live without drinking, as he told Roland, there seemed to be, you had two ways. You could either keep yourself confined voluntarily or involuntarily as long as you live, or else you must almost certainly intermittently drink to excess until you die or go mad. And Roland said, is there no other way out? He said, yes. There have been a few cases I've never seen, I've heard about in the literature, where there's been some significant involuntary psychological inversion that they call some sort of a spiritual experience that literally changes their perception. But he said they're so rare, it's almost, of the millions of cases, I don't only know of two. And it turned out that, of all things, that through the series of funny little events, this low-down, jobless bum gigolo wife, living off his wife guy in Brooklyn named Bill Wilson, had one of those spiritual experiences. And eventually, after they had evolved some way to stay sober by helping others, and they wrote this book, Alcoholics Anonymous. Incidentally, it's kind of an interesting thing. The first printing, if you ever see a big red book, you'll see something that's not in any book after that. It said, step 12 reads, having had a spiritual experience as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. And, of course, the members then came up to Bill and said, how can that be, Bill? We haven't had any spiritual experience. You're the only one who had a spiritual experience. And you didn't have it as a result of these steps. You had it in Towns Hospital 4 years before you thought of the steps. How do you explain that? And he couldn't explain it. And they thought about that a long time. Fortunately, the book sold so slowly they didn't have to make any quick answers, you know. And that's, I think, what has evolved into understanding that particular point is what makes Alcoholics Anonymous what it is. Alcoholics Anonymous is full of people, I believe, who come here knowing that there is no therapy here that can help them. Because it always goes back to the same thing. They want me to stop drinking, and it helps a lot of people, but it doesn't help me. It helps me a little bit. I don't vomit. I can get a job for a while. But it's been said by all our speakers, and will be said again. Eventually, it gets so bad that I can't stand it. My problem is not alcohol. If there's a flag that people like me will carry all my life, I've often thought I'd like to be the Betsy Ross of Alcoholics Anonymous and design a flag we could all gather under. And it wouldn't say, I need booze. It would say, but you don't understand. And then we could get a march on Washington and demand our rights. Except the way we are, we'd all wind up in Seattle and say, well, who do we talk to here now? But I look at my life, and I thought I was quite bright, and I had fairly good jobs. And I came to AA time after time for 10 years for it to work. But it became obvious to me after a year or two. AA doesn't work for people like me. Because my problem is not really alcohol. It looks like it is when I'm drunk, but it isn't. My problem is I'm secretly inadequate. And I have to pretend I'm not. My problem is I don't think people really like me. My problem is I've been hurt a lot by others. My problem is I'm too vulnerable. I try to disguise it. My problem is I just don't feel like I'm enough. And when people get too close to me, they can see that, and then they don't like me. And for people like me, it's almost impossible to have any close relationship because you can't dare let them see what you really are. So you have to keep them at a distance. And I discovered when I was a boy, 15 years old, on a ship in the South Pacific, and thereafter, that if you don't vomit up the alcohol and you can breathe, this makes things look all different. When I drink, I feel like I'm enough. More than enough, sometimes. When I drink, I don't feel vulnerable. I feel invulnerable sometimes. I don't feel afraid. I don't feel rejected. I don't get my feelings hurt much. I hurt people's feelings. If people hurt my feelings, we're going to go outside and fight, you son of a bitch. I would never do that sober. And it makes me feel like I'm something. It makes me feel the way other people look. I understand that thing from, the Yale Institute of Alcoholic Studies. It changes my psychological profile. And it turns out that is I didn't know this for a long time, but that is what makes an alcoholic. People are always wondering, did I really go to jail enough to be an alcoholic? Did I go to the nut house enough to be an alcoholic? We hear all these garish stories and after a while you just wonder what it all means. How can you be an alcoholic? A real alcoholic, I didn't draw a sober breath for 25 years. You think, oh, that's an alcoholic. That guy got a problem. Or you hear these crazy guys, and then I escaped from San Quentin, raped 4 nuns, and then I went bad after that. Wow. How could I be an alcoholic? My problem isn't like that. I'm not that way. And probably the greatest enemy of sobriety, it seems to me, is that the innate pattern of people like me, and I presume like you, is to measure my alcoholism by what it has done to me. And that's really just a side effect. That is absolutely irrelevant. But sometimes it's enough to make you check where you are. That's the only value of it. It turns out, as we all know, that alcoholics are measured by what alcohol does for you. That's what makes an alcoholic. Unless it does something special for you, it will never do anything to you. Because when it starts doing something to you, you quit. But if it's doing something special for you, you've got to take that came with it, and hopefully it won't be so bad. That little paragraph in chapter 3 that we read, sometimes we read chapter 3, it's so kind of funny. Sometimes people laugh when they read it. Here's what we did. We changed from scotch to brandy. We drank only wine. We only drank at home. We never drank at home. We swore off with or without a solemn oath. We read spiritual literature. We took trips. We didn't take trips. On and on. Isn't that funny? But I'm sure that everyone in this room that's an alcoholic has done these things. Maybe not those specific things, but things like it. And that's why they put at the end of that paragraph, we could increase this list ad infinitum, which means forever. Now, what would that list be covering? It covers people like me, and I presume like you, when alcohol that has enabled me to feel like something on a continuing basis now has become a problem, and sometimes a severe problem. And so I quit drinking, and I realized that was not, now I'm back to the problem. It's like having an abscessed tooth and swear off Novocaine. It's just, and it just makes you crazy. It's just amazing how perceptive that book was when he wrote it, because he didn't know enough to write. Little things like, there seems to be a point at which there's no adequate defense against the first drink. And I've been there many times, and most of the people in this room have. That's not my problem, and you don't understand. And I go to AA, and it seems to me they're saying, if you get sober, you'll feel better. And that's why I always knew I couldn't be a real alcoholic. Because I drink like an alcoholic, I get in trouble like an alcoholic, but the problem is this. Unlike alcoholics, when I get sober and clean up my act, that's when my life gets painful. And that's when my emotions get out of whack. And that's when all those feelings come back little by little. And I'm unable to sustain anything on them. One-to-one relationships. I used to look back after I was sober a while and think, why have I never been able to sustain a one-to-one relationship with anybody? And I could look back and it became quite clear, and I've seen it in many other people since then. When you have nothing inside of you, no self-worth to speak of, you must get whatever worth you get from other people, from their eyes and from their attention. So I wound up in a situation, it sounds funny, but it's really pathetic. Right? Anytime I have a close one-to-one relationship, I've had much of my life, all I ask of you, just treat me special all the time. And because if you treat me special, I feel average. And if you treat me average, I feel rejected. And there's nobody in the world that's going to treat you special all the time. After a while, sometimes just the mere fact of accepting you gets you more informal. But to me, that means they don't like me anymore. I didn't like you anyway, now that I think about it. And on and on. I guess there are people who sit and drink with other people for their life, but people like me are bar drinkers. When this bar they don't treat me special anymore, I go to the next bar. And the next group, and the next love, and the next on and on and on. And never knowing there was no possible answer for my problem. But here and now, I got an answer, alcohol which works, And now they're telling me I can't do that. So I get into that paragraph. Why? What does that paragraph mean? The paragraph means I realize I can't stay sober, so I'm going to try to find a way to drink without the problem. I'm going to just drink wine, maybe. A few years ago, the central office sent me over to KGIL or one of those stations to do a public service radio program. A guy wanted to interview me for AA. My name on the program was Alcoholic Al. And I talked a little bit about alcoholism. And this woman called it from Laguna Beach or Newport Beach, something she said. And she had a very cultured voice. She said, I don't know if you ever heard of a case like this. She said, but I seem to have some form of drinking problem with my wines. She said, I just drink wines, and very fine wines, but they almost become addictive. Have you ever heard of anything like that? I said, yes, man, we call that a wino. She made a noise like a dial tone, the damnedest thing. But you get to this problem now. And now there's a name for this condition. It is called alcoholism of our type. You no longer can drink with impunity, and you can't stay sober. And there you are. You stay sober as long as you can till you have to drink. And you drink till you have to get sober. And you stay sober till you have to drink. And you drink till you have to stay sober. Alcoholism. And today in America, where there's more sobriety than any place in the history of the world, it is estimated by some people that about 95% of alcoholics still die drunk, or as a direct result of drinking. And I'm sure this is an average meeting, a fairly average meeting of alcoholics, maybe upper scale alcoholics, but alcoholics. I think it's safe to say that a number of people in this room will die drunk. Not because AA doesn't work, not because there's not an answer. But somewhere along the line, it will seem no longer necessary to apply the answer. And little by little, I will revert to an untenable sobriety. That's one of the great reasons for meetings today. You know, meetings were originally started, the first meetings, as I understand it, so that they could take a newcomer somewhere and they could see actual sober alcoholics, because there's no place else in the world you could do that. And little by little, meetings have continued to be that, but it's evolved into something much different, where we go and get spiritual reinforcement. And one of the great things we learn here, if you can stay here a while, that's why it's so good. It really helps you to be desperate when you come here, because you may lower some of your defenses against what you do. And so it turns out that Alcoholics Anonymous has this strange set of therapies which are not anywhere near as good as other therapies are. And they seem to be strange because they don't deal with the problem of my emotions. When I have emotional problems, I want to go talk to someone who is skillful and trained in dealing with emotional problems. A psychiatrist, a psychologist. I've spent thousands and thousands of dollars in my life on psychotherapy and trying to find an answer to these problems. Now that's where you go and have emotional problems. Maybe you go to AA for drinking, but these are emotional problems. And it just seems strange because these trained people, they have an answer. They say, you come to us, we will change your thinking, and eventually your actions will change and you will live better. And AA, these well-meaning amateurs, they mean well, they're nice people, no, but they're not very good at what they do, apparently. They get everything, you come to us, and we'll change your actions, and your thinking will get better. No, you don't understand. And what helps you, if you could stay here a little while, is to one day stumble upon the most amazing fact. These amateurs have 10,000 rooms full of sober alcoholics all over the world, and the doctors do not have one. But it takes a while to understand that. And that's why the desperation helps here, because it can impel you to take actions. A couple of months ago, I was talking up in Toronto. They had a question and answer, question and answer. And you probably would never guess this, but I have a tendency to talk a lot. And they're asking me questions, and my answer, when somebody asks me a question that's difficult, I talk for a few minutes while I think of the answer. You know. And this woman in the back of the room, God, she was a bad one. She said, if you don't mind, I wouldn't want one of your long answers. She said, could you put it in short, just a sentence or two? You slipped for 10 years and now you're sober almost 40 years. What was the difference this time? And I couldn't think of the answer in a sentence or two. And I was going to simulate a heart attack, but I didn't. Time's up. Well, that's about sorry, ma'am. But I thought about it in the shower, and I thought about that day, and I was giving a talk, and I thought it's such a simple thing, but it sounds so odd to complex imitation intellectuals like me when I'm new. This is the first time that I took actions I did not agree with and that I thought were stupid. That doesn't sound like much, does it? But everybody comes to AA, we talk about action. I'll be glad to take any action as long as I agree with it and makes sense. And it turns out those are not the actions that change your life. The actions that change your life are the actions that don't. You know, the classic case of the sponsor saying, now, you've got this terrible depression. I want you to take this action. And you don't say anything, but your head just goes off. You don't understand. I know you mean well, and I know you're trying to help me, but you can't possibly know me as well as I know me. And that sort of thing just makes me worse. You just don't understand. That can't work, you think. And then go do it. And that is the difference between staying sober or not. Whether or not, after all that, you go take the action. I remember a day that I lost my job as a dishwasher at the Gaiety Delicatessen, 6 months sober. And I determined to kill myself. And my sponsor said, take your inventory. And I just told him the week before, I've taken my inventory with a psychiatrist. Why want to take it with an out-of-work actor, for Christ's sake? What good's that going to do? And then that made him testy. Everything made him testy. And I can't... Taking an inventory doesn't help me. It makes me more depressed. In my judgment, that doesn't help. And he explained that to me. He said, in your judgment? Who cares about your judgment? You've been living in the backseat of an abandoned car, for Christ's sake. If I wanted your judgment, I'd put the head in the back window and ask you for it. You know? And I took an inventory and I put stuff in there I never told anybody. And a week later, he had me ride with him in the car in the Oxnard, and I read it with a flashlight. And 2 weeks after that, I was sitting at meetings at the 6300 Club and saying, I don't know how you can expect to stay sober unless you're willing to write an inventory the way we've done. That's the nature. But this AA thing consisting of actions, that's all you have to do is take actions. You don't have to believe in anything much because the actions, it turns out, they don't care who takes them. But little by little, they bring about sobriety. Now, what is this sobriety they bring about? How can that be? These dumb little actions. Because it turns out, I think it took a while after they questioned Bill, but I think they've come to a little feeling then, and they have a much more greater feeling now. What is the purpose of the steps to Alcoholics Anonymous? It doesn't, if you have to have a spiritual experience, only Bill had it. How can other people stay sober? I believe it to be correct, and I bet my life on it, that Alcoholics Anonymous, the steps of AA, in some way that are still puzzling, but puzzling or not, the steps of AA do something that nothing else has done in the history of the treatment of alcoholism, in the history of the world. They bring about an incremental spiritual experience. Not the way Bill Wilson had his, but the way we get ours. Make amends to that bitch. And what happens, what it brings about is the same, I believe this. I believe the purpose of AA, because some newcomers say, well, why are you still active after 40 years? Why is Harvey Andrews still going to meetings after 40 years? how sober can you get? And it isn't to get you sober. You get sober in the first week. The point is that from then on, I have to do things that will change, that will replace alcohol. And what alcohol does for me, it alters my perception of reality. And now it seems quite clear. That is what Alcoholics Anonymous is designed to do. To alter my perception of reality. And left to myself, I'm rather intense and I have strong emotions. Psychiatrists once said I'd have to take medications all my life because of the intensity of my emotions. But somehow here, in doing these things and redressing this imbalance on a continuing basis by going to meetings and trying to be some help to others, it has brought about a change of perception. I believe that the purpose of AA is to very slowly do what alcohol does fast. It takes a person like me who never felt like I'm enough. And today, much of the time, I feel like I'm enough. Sometimes I don't. That used to bother me. Think, why do I feel like I'm enough all the time? I'm doing the best I can. And it turns out no human being feels like they're enough all the time. That's just part of being a human being. It takes a person like me who's lived with fear all my life. Fear of exposure, fear of danger, fear of anything. And today I find myself, not much of the time I'm not afraid. As some of you know, 2 or 3 times the last few years, I've gone down alleys on Skid Row where the police do not choose to go down with drawn guns. And I'm down there with my mouth to pull some son of a bitch out. People say, oh, Clancy, you're so fearless. I'm not. I know how to do that. I know I'm not fearless because if I was sitting at home in my living room with my wife Charlotte, and at night and we heard this threatening noise in the backyard, I'd send her to see what it was. Because it might be a boogeyman. And everybody knows that boogeymen are more afraid of Al-Anons than AAs. That's all. No, even boogeymen can't stand up to that cold smile. It takes a person like me that has a great deal of difficulty sustaining relationships. I've been able to sustain some relationships. And so in the second printing of the book, and ever since then, the only step they've changed is the 12th step. It now says, as we all know, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of the steps. And in so doing, we bring about a spiritual experience. And once you get that spiritual experience, that doesn't mean that you're going to keep it. Because even Bill Wilson, who had the spiritual experience at the age of 6 months, was ready to quit. Because he had had no luck with drinkers. And so it says in our book, again wisely, our sobriety seems to be based on the maintenance of our spiritual condition. Based on what? Interminable prayer, some prayer, some meditation. More primarily being of service. I don't know a better way to describe how to maintain what limited change of perception AA has given me that's enabled me to live in the world with some degree of peace when nothing else in my life has ever done it. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. In 1950, the first international convention, it brought all these people together, tried to sell them the traditions, and try to get them to understand that they're all alike, not to hate each other as they were doing. And on Friday night, or Saturday afternoon, I should say, Dr. Bob was brought to the podium dying of cancer. He had to be helped to the podium, but he wanted so much to convey what he had found. And he's having, I've got tapes of that, very touching. Got a photograph of it, actually. And he's down there and he starts off by saying, you must pardon me, my health hasn't been quite as much good as I've been in bed much of the last few months. He said, but I want to welcome you, boys and girls, from all the people, from other people back home. But then he synthesized, he wanted to convey what he had learned. He converted it into 3 points. And to me, they've always been the absolute germ of Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, I would be indeed remiss if I didn't try to pass along a couple of things that might be of interest. 1, let us keep our program simple. Let us not louse it all up with Freudian complexes, which may be of interest to scientists, but have nothing to do with our work here. When reduced to the end, our work here consists of love and service. And we all know what love is. And we all know what service is. And secondly, he said, let us guard that erring member, the tongue, and try to use it with kindness and understanding and love. And just between you and me, there isn't a person in this room that doesn't need to hear that on a continuing basis. Because that tongue, when you're having a bad day, it just, or when you feel bad or someone threatens you. But just to remember that. The great thing about AA is when you fail today, you can try again tomorrow. And thirdly, he said, let us never reach that stage of smug complacency when we don't have time to help the man behind us, to give him a pat on the back when he needs it, to take him to a few meetings, because none of us would be here if someone hadn't done it for us. And then he thanked the people and he sat down and he died shortly thereafter. And to me, as I look at that, it almost brings tears to my eyes to think about that guy in terrible pain being helped to the podium to say those things that I need to hear so desperately on a continuing basis. And I don't know anything. And what's the point of them all? To make you wonderful and be better than humans? Not at all. So that you and I can maintain a changed perception of reality, so that we need never drink, we need never try to kill ourselves, we need never run, we need never escape again, but we can live here. At the end of the long form of the 12th tradition says, this to the end that our great blessings may never spoil us, that we shall forever live in thankful contemplation of Him who presides over us all. Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing. Taper Dave here. Just wanted to take a second to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you like what you're listening. I've got some very good talks here, and this one's a great one. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Tell me what you think. Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside. Then power it on one short burst and one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. I don't know if that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right, but I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.